Good afternoon, everyone. Tom Springer, shareholder with Snyder Downs. I'm responsible for strategy and transaction advisory. And as part of our Take 10 with Tom, we're going to talk about a complex and often misunderstood topic, purchase price adjustments. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Stuart Lawson. He's a director with strategy and transaction advisory. Welcome, Stu.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be here today.
Excellent. So as part of a purchase price, when we do transactions, we often go through a process, a very formal process, where a buyer and a seller are trying to reach a mutual benefit or mutual decision, to get mutual benefit, essentially. As we go through that, most sellers have a concept that they're going to get some multiple of EBITDA, adjusted EBITDA. And they have in their head, this is the amount of money that they're going to get. But often that's not the case. So the reason that's not the case is because of purchase price adjustments. So Stu, can you give us a little bit of a vibe of what is a purchase price adjustment? What's the impact of purchase price adjustments?
So Tom, this is a great topic. And as you indicated, a lot of time owners are under the perception that they're going to get a multiple of EBITDA when they sell their company. In reality, when they're selling their company, they're getting the equity value of the company. So one of the initial adjustments that takes place when they sell equity is that they get the cash off the balance sheet, but are also responsible for paying off all the term debt that the company may have at that point in time. And the definition of debt is one of the most significant purchase price adjustments because that can often encompass more than just term debt. So for an example, so many times we see, especially with technology companies, deferred revenue or component thereof is treated as debt and thus is a reduction of purchase price in the calculation within the purchase agreement.
Excellent. I appreciate that insight. And with that insight, as we go through these engagements, we often see a rub between buyer and seller. In particular, they're struggling to figure out a working capital peg. And a lot of folks out there wonder, what is a working capital peg? Stu, what is a working capital peg?
So again, a really good question. So this is one of the most difficult items to explain to an owner. But when you sell your company, what you leave behind for the buyer is the amount of working capital in the business that they will need to run the business for a period of time. So working capital, the technical accounting definition, is current assets minus current liabilities. So since the owner walks away with the cash, those current liabilities are reduced. So effectively, it's receivables is the primary one that we see. And payables or payroll liabilities would be on the liability side of the ledger, so to speak. So that net amount, current assets minus current liabilities, is the amount that is expected to convert to cash within the next 12 months. So the buyer expects that the seller is going to leave behind ample working capital for them to be able to run the business for a period of time. So a peg or target is established. And to the extent working capital as of the close date is greater than the peg, then that is additional purchase price to the seller. And if it's lower, that ends up being a reduction of purchase price. And that peg is negotiated as part of the process.
Excellent insight. Thank you for that. And with that insight too, a lot of times the buyer and the seller struggle through that negotiation and they don't reach agreement necessarily right up front. So we get pretty creative with some techniques that we use in order to get them through the process. Can you talk a little bit about how we mitigate the risk or what buyers use as techniques to help them to manage through that process?
Yeah, so there's typically a negotiation process, as you noted, on both sides. So a lot of times a buyer will have a team that comes in to do a very complex analysis of working capital. But as a seller, we try to work with them to do the same sort of thing. So we'll look at trending, seasonal and otherwise, annual averages, 6 months averages, and so forth, and try and actually best position them relative to the peg. And again, it's a negotiation process with the two sides typically meeting some sort of a middle ground.
Excellent. No, again, excellent insight there. And with that insight, we also use techniques, or there are things that are employed to, protect buyer from what sellers telling them, reps, warranties, escrows, things. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those things are at a deeper level?
So certainly. So a lot of times in a deal, in fact, in most deals, there's something called indemnification escrows that are put aside. And indemnification escrows are intended to cover the reps and warranties that are provided in a purchase agreement. So reps and warranties are representation that the buyer is making to the seller. And they typically involve representations about the business or the assets or liabilities of the business. So by way of an example, a rep and warranty may be that I am providing you with intellectual property and I am repping to you that we have valid title to that intellectual property. Well, if something were to come up where someone would come by, potentially question that, there's an escrow that's set aside that would handle those claims. So the amount of the escrow is typically determined as an amount of purchase price. However, to your point, you can also go out and purchase what's called rep and warranty insurance. So instead of putting the escrow aside, what you're effectively putting aside is the amount of retention that may be required for rep and warranty insurance. So rep and warranty insurance is just like buying a policy, and it's typically determined based on a percentage of what an indemnification escrow would usually comprise. So if an indemnification escrow typically ranges between 5 to 8% of purchase price, and then the rep and warranty insurance is typically a percentage of that, and then retention or deductible is also established.
No,
so it limits the amount of money that needs to be set aside, so it's actually more dollars in the pocket of the seller at closing.
Yeah, no, that's, again, great insight. And you can see that it's much more complex than a multiple of EBITDA. And let me go sell my business. So what are some of the things that buyers can do and we help them do in advance of a sale to mitigate or prevent some of these downstream, challenges that they may have that we've talked about?
So one of the big things is we really want to understand the seller's business and those little nuances. So if I were to refer back to a tech business with deferred revenue, for instance, and treating that as debt, we want to understand with that, what is really the cost of performing on that deferred revenue. So instead of setting the whole deferred revenue aside, we may set aside what the actual cost of the performance is as it relates to that deferred revenue component. So the more we understand about the business and get into the little nuances, the better positioned we are to help negotiate a successful transaction.
Excellent. Again, appreciate that insight. And, as always, in closing out our topic of the day, it's really important to engage an expert early in the process to help increase enterprise value, ultimately, which leads typically to a higher purchase price and prevents challenges in the transaction that would ultimately derail or crater a deal. So again, Stu, thanks for coming out and sharing your insight. We appreciate it.
No, you're quite welcome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone.